The tradition of continental philosophy has this idea of the masters of suspicion, really talking about the 20th century as one of decline. So here we have Marx, of course, the thinker who predicts the growing inequality in society around economic relations, eventually reaching a point of fever pitch and contradiction, and the society slowly unraveling. So even if you disagree with the solution, I think the diagnosis is pretty spot on. With Nietzsche, we have our first thinker of really the idea that truth is a meta-narrative, or at least a society having some kind of glorious meta-narrative around which to coalesce is impossible as we expand as societies and get a sense of the postmodern truth that really, when it comes to our species, there are just competing truths, which is a destructive and corrosive effect in his thinking. And then Freud, of course, is a thinker who really brings up our anxieties around the loss of individuality. So even though it appears we're trending toward individuality at the time that he's writing, really we are lost in mass hysteria. It's actually harder to be an individual. Masters of Dissolution really, I think, describes the 21st century. So these are the thinkers who accelerate the process. Foucault shows us that institutions are really just power bases that begin to believe in their own documentation and narratives that they create as bureaucracies, believing that by solving the homeless problem in Paris and creating prisons, that actually prisons are an essential part of society, etc. Derrida does much the same, except with gender identity, the influence of which you can see pretty much everywhere in the West. And Nick Land, the thinker that actually the human itself is to be superseded by something like a artificial intelligence, which is self-constructing itself through human elements, not humans themselves, but the markets and technology that we tend to create. All of which is part of the decline, but I think we're probably transitioning slowly toward the era of the fall. And when it gets to a society that is in free fall and collapse, well, then the topics begin to shift away from suspicion and dissolution, and really it's a question of war. Trotsky, my favorite quote is, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." And this becomes especially important in times when the state needs to find something to focus its attention on, Sauron style. And crypto is one, a small, but one of the many facets of this. And the wider or bigger implication really when it comes to crypto is it's just an example of the state's growing tendency to regulate privacy out of existence. So the 1984 scenario would be the clearest here. Also, Children of Men, I think, is another important science fiction prescient documentation of this idea of falling into the surveillance state. In Network, another example is where Jensen delivers a speech. This film is from 1976, and this great speech where he is talking about the way in which there are certain elements of society where if you push back against them, in this case, he is talking about currency and money, that really what you're messing with is something like a primal force of nature. And crypto people have a tendency to forget that everything we do is us meddling with these primal forces of currency and finance. So we should never be shocked, like sometimes we tend to be. Oh my God, I can't believe the state is cracking down on us. But of course, we are meddling with primal forces of nature here. So with the decline and with the fall feeling ever more inevitable, the only position or way forward that I can think of is the one that was set out by Assange in Cypherpunks 2012, which is a very realpolitik document. It's not optimistic, it's not hopeful. Instead, it says, okay, well, what is the conditions? What are these situations that we find ourselves in? So he says, our task is to secure self-determination where we can, which I see as the job of those of you who have the ability and skill to be Phil Zimmermans and release our versions of PGP into the wild and propagate them as best you can, except, of course, in this case, being contemporary privacy-enhancing tools. To hold back the coming dystopia where we cannot, because the dystopia is coming, so it's just a case of holding it back at this point. You cannot stop the primal forces of nature when it comes to this dystopia. There are grander ideas and grander historical trends at work. but we can maybe hold back as much as possible. And if we are at the point, and this is something that we need to consider, it may be important tactically to begin thinking about, okay, well, if the fall comes and if the dystopia comes, then how can we actually accelerate its self-destruction rather than actually be on the defensive?